So this is the second to last chapter in Lamentations, and is, in my estimation, one of the harder sections to read, particularly this first section. And this is returning to some of the themes of chapters 1 and 2, where it's talking about very simply the desolation, the destruction, the suffering of Jerusalem. And so as we get ready to jump into Lamentations 4 tonight, let's take a moment this evening and open this time in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for your blessings, even in the midst of difficult times. Thank you for the fact that you chasten whom you love. We don't like to be chastened, but we appreciate that sign of fatherly love and care and concern. And Lord, I pray as we look into Lamentations this evening, that you would give us an understanding of the seriousness of sin and its consequences, and that you would give us an understanding of the place that lament as a type of prayer ought to have in the life of a believer. And Lord, I pray that you would be honored and glorified in this time. Lord, may this not be my show or about me. Lord, may this be about you. May this be the truth of your word, impacting the hearts of your people this evening, I pray. May we be open and receptive to the work of the Holy Spirit. May you be honored and glorified in that, I pray. And I ask this in your name. Amen. Again, if it sounds strange as we're going through this tonight, I'm reading out of the ESV for this short series simply for the fact of trying to bring out some of the more emotional language and descriptions of what is given here. As we pick up in Lamentations chapter 4, as we look at verse 1, the first 10 verses of chapter 4 deal with the suffering of the people and in particular the children. Chapter 1, verse 1, how the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold is changed. The holy stones lie scattered at the head of every street. So we can see a return to the themes of chapters 1 and 2. And in fact, chapter 4 starts out with the same Hebrew word that chapter 1 started with, the word for how, which is actually the name of the book in the Torah, the Jewish, the Hebrew Old Testament. It's not actually called Lamentations. It's called how, that word. And it's a cry of mourning. It's, alas, how could this happen is the idea of that. And the gold growing dim and being changed, of course, it's devalued. The stones of the sanctuary, the holy stones scattered at the head of every street. The temple is destroyed, and probably this is also serving as metaphors for the people as well, the valuable people, the wealthy people, and the holy people, the spiritual leadership, all laid low. And, both of those. And then in verse 2, rather than being regarded as especially worthy, like gold dishes, the precious sons of Zion worth their weight in fine gold, how they are regarded as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. And if you were to be given a choice, one of those where you had to choose this or this and, 2 boxes, and you were told that inside of one is a solid gold dish, 24 carats golden dish, and in the other is a clay pot that was, made in somebody's backyard. Most people will go for the box with the gold pot. If they know, which one is which, that's what they're going to go for because it's more valuable. And this contrast in this verse, you have, the children of Jerusalem, the sons of Zion, they're precious, worth their weight in fine gold, but they're being regarded as almost worthless, just, earthen pots in this period. I mean, that was like the disposable plates, the disposable, bowls, the paper plates and stuff of that time period where, you would use it. And if it got broken, it's no big deal. It wasn't expensive or difficult to make. And there's that degradation. The children of God among the nations, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, have been cast aside like cheap earthenware, both by their enemies and seemingly by God. And if you were go to Jeremiah chapter 19, in verses 10 and 11, there's actually an enacted oracle from the prophet Jeremiah. And an enacted oracle is where a prophet of God would be commanded by God to do something that would act out the message that God was getting across. And so, for example, when Hosea was commanded by God to marry Gomer, who was a prostitute, That obviously is not standard operating procedure for God's prophets, okay? Uh, and she ends up being unfaithful to him, which ultimately was to be expected, and all of that to show Israel's spiritual adultery and unfaithfulness to God, whom she belonged to, by worshiping other idols and chasing after other gods. And so it was called an enacted oracle, where this is the pronouncement of the prophet, but it's actually being physically acted out. And in Jeremiah chapter 19, Jeremiah is instructed by the Lord to take a clay pot and break it, symbolizing the breaking and destruction of Jerusalem and of Judah. So it kind of seems to be hearkening back to that. And if Jeremiah was indeed the writer of Lamentations, then certainly that would have been on his mind as he wrote that. Verse 3, even the jackals offer the breast, they nurse their young, but the daughter of my people has become cruel like the ostriches in the wilderness. And here even the wild dogs could feed their young and still cared for them, but not the people of Jerusalem. And jackals, being a haunt of jackals is an expression that's already been used in Lamentations, as I recall. And maybe it wasn't in Lamentations, but that's an expression to describe a place that is desolate. And so these are like the wild animals that don't live where people are, and that kind of desolation. And then ostriches, and often those two show up together in poetic writing in books like Isaiah and Job and Micah. And the ostriches were perceived as being thoughtless brutes, terrible parents. If you go to Job chapter 39, verses 13 through 18, there's this description of ostriches. They're just careless. They lay their eggs in the sand where they could be trampled, or things like that. And they're just not good parents. And here you have the people of Israel, and they're not even able to take care of their children, and they're being pictured in that way. And in verse 4, and this is where I think it gets particularly rough, the tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives it to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. And so Jerusalem's sin, and Israel's as a whole, has finally brought its destructive fruits to pass. And everyone is suffering as a result. And that's one aspect of sin that oftentimes is ignored by people at large. We tend to think of sin in individual terms, right? That's your sin, this is my sin. But it doesn't always work that way in the real world. In fact, it often doesn't work that way. Often, as a result of this person's sin, someone who is completely innocent of that sin in that situation will suffer as a result. You don't have to make the decision to drive drunk to get into an accident and be killed by somebody who is driving drunk. They can make that decision, and you end up paying the consequences, and your friends and family, as they mourn the loss, or somebody who is, makes the decision to be abusive and to harm someone. One of them is suffering, but they're not the one making the sinful choice. And that is often the case. The innocent will often suffer for the sins of others. And we see that here in Jerusalem being described as they are in exile. And sin's seriousness is often downplayed by those who don't want to confront it. But I do wonder how our views would change if we could see somehow the ramifications of all of our sinful choices playing out, not just for us, but for everyone around us, everybody else who is having to deal with the consequences of those sinful choices. Or can you think of a time when you have suffered because of someone else's sin? And that might be a little easier to recall, I guess. We're maybe a little bit quicker to grasp onto that kind of a thing, and to get worked up over someone else's sin and perhaps excuse our own. But, we see that principle of, those who haven't committed the sin suffering because of those who have. And one of the terrible and unfortunate aspects of sinfulness. And it does work the other way, by the way. At times, Israel was blessed not because of their righteousness, but because of God's promise to Abraham, because Abraham loved and obeyed God and things like that. All of us have benefited from the righteousness of Christ, which we did nothing to earn or accomplish. So it can work both ways. I don't want to ignore that. However, in this passage, we're not seeing people enjoying the benefits of other people's righteousness. We see innocent people suffering because of the sins of still other people. And verse 5, people who have feasted on the finest foods and been dressed in the finest clothes are now scavenging in garbage heaps looking for scraps, or perhaps they're ill because they're there because they're ill and they're weak. And the wealthiest and supposedly the most righteous have been cast down hard. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. Verse 6, for the chastisement of the daughter of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment, and no hands were wrung for her. Jerusalem was, and in Israel as a whole, was held to a higher standard because of the special covenant they had entered into with God. And because of the fact that they had special knowledge of God's law and expectations. And because of the fact that they had had many, many years of warnings. How much warning did Sodom and Gomorrah get? Just Lot going, hey, family, we need to get out of here. That was the warning that they got. However, how much warning did Israel and did Jerusalem get? I mean, we're talking literally centuries. Dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of prophets coming and saying, this is what Israel is doing wrong, and this is how we are offending God, and this is what we need to do to get right. And many times Israel's response was, get lost, or even to imprison or kill the prophets who were speaking for God. And so their suffering ended up being the greater. They were held to a higher standard. And their suffering was much worse in that it was drawn out. And Sodom and Gomorrah were, and they still are, considered the archetypes of well-deserved punishment. And for the writer of Lamentations to compare Jerusalem to Sodom and Gomorrah would have been a shocking thing, because Sodom and Gomorrah, they obviously deserved it, but we're God's chosen people. So it would have been a shocking comparison. And not only that, but to say that, Jerusalem is worse than Sodom and Gomorrah and deserves worse. Verse 7 and verse 8, we see an interplay as verse 7, they're healthy and wealthy and well-fed ewes. They've been protected from the sun and hard labor. Her princes were purer than snow, whiter than milk. They haven't been out laboring in the fields, getting sunburned and deeply tanned and all of that. They've been inside, and I have people waving fans to keep them cool and all of those kinds of things. And they're eating the best food. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral. The beauty of their form was like sapphire. These are, handsome young people. Verse 8, completely reversed. Now their face is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as wood. So whereas you have the picture of health and beauty and all of that, it's completely reversed, and their faces are darkened with the idea of starvation and probably with just dirt and grime, and their skin is dry and stretched. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of things like the German death camps and concentration camps, what people look like when they're starving to death, and it is not a pleasant sight. And that's the description that we have here. In verse 9, happier were the victims of the sword than the victims of hunger, who wasted away, pierced by lack of the fruits of the field. And it seems to many the sudden death of the sword would have been greatly preferable to the slow, painful, desperate wasting away of starvation. And most people, you ask almost anybody how they would like to die. And typically, they're not looking for a long, drawn-out process. They're like, man, I just hope it's quick and in my sleep, And that's the preference. Instead, many people have been starving to death in Jerusalem and dealing with all of that, wasting away. And by all accounts, starvation is a very painful and slow way to die. And we get to verse 10. The hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. They became their food during the destruction of the daughter of my people. Of course, motherhood, even after the fall, is usually considered the pinnacle of selfless love. That's where you expect to see selflessness no matter what. And yet even the tender and compassionate mothers have done the unthinkable and been driven to do that. In 2 Kings chapter 6, we see an example of that playing out that did literally happen. Although 2 Kings chapter 6, that's an example of that took place when Syria was laying siege to Samaria. It's not Jerusalem being besieged by Babylon, but according to the poet here, that was something that also happened during this siege. In Deuteronomy 28:53, foretold of that, and then it did come to pass. And this is a kind of situation that, frankly, I don't know that any of us have any kind of real practical concept of what it would be like to be that desperate. It's unthinkable. It's unimaginable. And that is what you get when you have a people who are completely unmoored from God. And that is what you get when you have people and who are dealing with the consequences of sin. We tend to think of the consequences of sin as, well, it's unpleasant, it's not fun. But these people are so desperate that, and this is not like these are the nasty people. These are the compassionate women, the tender, the sensitive women who care for people, and especially their children. And yet they have been driven to cannibalize their own children. It is a terrible place to be when we are apart from God. In verse 11, it becomes a little bit more impersonal, and God's punishment of the leaders of Jerusalem, and especially the religious leaders, is described in here. So we pick up in verse 11. The Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger. He kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. This was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests, who shed in the midst of her the blood of the righteous. They wandered blind through the streets. They were so defiled with blood that no one was able to touch their garments. Away, unclean, people cried at them. Away, do not touch. So they became fugitives and wanderers. People said among the nations, they shall stay with us no longer. The Lord himself has scattered them. He will regard them no more. No honor was shown to the priests, no favor to the elders. And while many thought that Jerusalem was untouchable, the reality was that it had simply been under God's protection. And ultimately, Jerusalem and Israel, they were untouchable so long as they stayed within God's covenant promises. And God described that back in Deuteronomy. If you as a people will honor and obey me faithfully, you will be blessed and protected. And if you disregard this and you start pursuing the gods of other nations and disregarding these laws, then I will remove my protection and I will instead bring justice and punishment. And that is what happened to Israel. So they were untouchable for a time, but in the end, they rejected God. God lifted his protection and put judgment in its place. It's almost like a judge, issued, this isn't a great analogy, but it's kind of an analogy. You can imagine somebody who had been issued diplomatic immunity by a judge, and then they abuse that, and then later on the judge revokes it and instead brings them to justice for their crimes. It's a bit like that. And this is the Jerusalem that has faced the reckoning of their sins. And verse 13 here touches on a central issue, and that is the complete and utter moral failure of Jerusalem's leadership, especially the spiritual leadership. Her prophets and priests have completely failed in their jobs. Nobody thought that Jerusalem could fall to an enemy army because repeatedly throughout history they had won against the odds. Repeatedly. Excuse me, but foe was able to enter into the gates of Jerusalem. Why? Because this was for the sins of her prophets, the iniquity of her priests, who shed in the midst of her the blood of the righteous. And you go back and you read, start reading in 1 Samuel, read all the way through the end of 2 Chronicles, and you'll see a lot of that described as, righteous people are being killed and the wicked people are being allowed to run rampant and have their way and so forth. And again, the reckoning has finally come. And these previously great people now wander the streets, and they're dirty, and they're starving, and they're bloody, and they're unclean, and nobody wants anything to do with them. And these refugees were summarily rejected by the nations around them. And it's not just people who are rejecting Israel's failed spiritual leadership, but the Lord himself is rejecting them. Because those who have been entrusted with the care of his sheep instead led them astray and preyed upon them. And they had failed in their responsibilities as the spiritual and religious leaders in Israel. And then in verses 17 through 20, we see the power of Jerusalem's enemies described. Our eyes failed, ever watching vainly for help. In our watching, we watched for a nation which could not save. They dogged our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end drew near, our days were numbered, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles in the heavens. They chased us on the mountains. They lay wait for us in the wilderness. The breath of our nostrils, the Lord's anointed, was captured in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. And, Jerusalem was relying on the help of Egypt. However, Egypt was unable to save them from Babylon. And notice that Egypt is a type or a picture of the world in Hebrew literature, right? Egypt was a symbol for the world. So when Israel was delivered from Egypt, they were being delivered from the world. That was a picture of that. Ultimately, in a grand sense, a picture of salvation, of God's people being delivered from slavery to sin and to the world. And who was, and this was, that was well-known imagery for the Jews, right? That's very, very well understood. And who was it when they were falling under siege to Babylon? Whom did they call for help? Did they call out to the world, to man, or did they call out to God? They called out to man. And as Jeremiah prophesied in Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 5 through 8, the strength of man would fail them and bring a curse upon them, and it did. And it's in that passage we have the verse that is often quoted, the heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it? Or desperately wicked, deceitful above all things, who can know it? And humanly speaking, there was nothing that Israel could do. God had delivered them many times from enemies greater than they were, and now he has delivered them to enemies that were greater than they were. Many times Israel and Jerusalem had wished to be free of God and their covenant with him and to be able to imitate the nations around them. And God has granted that request and sent them to dwell with the nations they wanted to imitate. However, it wasn't a very pleasant experience. And, raising children, you end up doing that at times. You give them what they want when you know it will be unpleasant. And they're not going to enjoy it. It's not going to be something that they, had they known, they would not have wished for that. But nevertheless, in their stubbornness, they wished for it anyway. And Israel had that mentality. When it came time that they decided they wanted a king, why was it that they wanted a king? So they could be like all the other kids on the block. And who were they rejecting and demanding a human king? Not just Samuel's sons, whom they said were the issue, but they were rejecting God. And that same attitude and mentality has perpetuated through much of Israel's history to this point. But then in verses 21 and 22, the lament actually ends on a hopeful note for Jerusalem. We see the end of Jerusalem's punishment. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom. That's not Israel, that's geographic neighbors. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, you who dwell in the land of Uz. But to you also the cup shall pass. You shall become drunk and strip yourself bare, which is an idea of being ashamed, acting shamefully. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer, but your iniquity, O daughter of Edom, he will punish. He will uncover your sins. And I guess we could paraphrase this and essentially say, enjoy it while it lasts, you pagans. You'll also have to deal with God's judgment. Edom was a nation to the southeast of Israel, and they had gloated over Israel's downfall, Jerusalem's downfall. You can look into Obadiah 10 and through 12. And they had probably actually allied with Babylon in order to avoid being destroyed by Babylon, and then gloated over the fall of Israel. But they could not escape the wrath of God forever, and there is that warning in there. And on the other hand, Israel's punishment is completed. They could look forward to a future restoration with God, and Edom had no such hope unless they chose as a nation to turn to God, which was admittedly unlikely. And so this lament ends on that note of hope for Israel and warning for her neighbors, and it recalls that God chastens his children whom he loves and will eventually mete out punishment and justice for all. And even punishment from our Heavenly Father is not the end. It is ultimately a sign of his love, however uncomfortable that sign may be, because nobody enjoys being chastened. Nobody enjoys being punished. We don't desire that. However, if we can look back over our lives and there has never been a time when we have felt the chastening hand of God, that's actually reason to be concerned, because that's an indication that we're not actually God's child, and that is a scary place to be. The reason that Jerusalem and Israel as a whole have suffered this destruction and exile is ultimately because they were God's chosen people, and actually because he was not done with them and had plans yet for them. So as we conclude tonight, the poet, and we can assume many of the people as well, recognize that this was punishment for their sins and the sins of their nation as a whole, going back hundreds of years. But even that did not stop them from crying out to God, from asking for deliverance, asking for restoration, and asking even for the nations which had brutalized them to also be judged. You know, as I touched on briefly this morning, lament is a messy kind of prayer, because real lament is real people coming to a real God, how they really are. And there's not, lament is not a showy kind of prayer. It's not a nice, fancy oration. Now, granted, this is poetry, and it was written by a poet who worked pretty hard on it to turn all of these into acrostics that worked well. But the point was not just to write some kind of emotional literature. The point was for a people to cry out to God for restoration and for healing and for reconciliation with him. And, it's messy because, while this might be literarily well constructed, it's a very raw and messy kind of prayer. I don't know what other kind of prayer you could have when you're talking about mothers eating their own children. And that kind of gut level discomfort. God is not searching for our laments to be, perfectly articulated orations, or really even any of our prayers, any more than you would necessarily, want your children to speak to you only in high poetry. God is seeking relationship with us, even in our sin and in our messiness. And the reason that we lament, that we bring up our problems and our suffering and the difficulties of life to God, is because we believe that God can do something about it. And maybe not in the way that I would want or hope right now, but that God will do something about it. That we serve a God who does, who accomplishes. He's not like Baal, who you can whirl all around and gyrate and stab yourself and slice yourself, and he's still not going to hear or care because he's out on a trip, or he's taking a trip to the restroom, or any of Elijah's various insults to them. Ultimately, the reason that Baal did not answer is because Baal is not real. Baal does not exist. He never has, except in the minds of men. And he can therefore accomplish nothing other than perhaps through a placebo type effect, where they're like, I'm pretty sure Baal's fighting for us, so we can probably win this, and then they kind of have that placebo effect and maybe end up winning the battle. But Baal could do nothing. The reason that we bring our laments to God is because he is a God who works, and there is always hope of restoration because of Christ. Even at that time when we are even deeply in sin and under God's chastisement, that's not the end. There is hope of restoration because of the work of Christ. And that is the goal of, in this case, they're lamenting the punishment of their sins. And the goal of that is, again, restoration. And that's the hope that is listed here in verse 22. The punishment of your iniquity, O daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer. The implication, he's going to bring you back to the land that he promised to your forefathers. You will again be his people in his covenant with his special blessings and care. And so that is, it's the reason that we lament, is because we're praying to a God who acts, and we're looking for that restoration. Well, thank you for coming tonight. Let's close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed this evening.